Maritza.
Wow. So I don't know. I think all that needs to be said for that one may have been said. But I'm gonna say one little thing. I will say that this chapter of Sullivan's on the tall building, it felt to me like the grown-up version of everything he was saying in the kindergarten chats. He spelled it out for us in a very simple way, in small, easy to digest pieces all throughout the book. And then I feel like you read this one and you thought you were mostly done. And this is actually for these last four. I thought I was mostly done with learning about Sullivan's philosophies. And then he just smacked me upside the head. And this one is okay, we've been spoon feeding you. Now you're going to like big people food here. And it's like very no nonsense, clear, concise way of just describing his view on architecture. And it's amazing. Even from the perspective of, not somebody who's architecture, I sadly do have to say it was not my favorite of all the articles here, but that may be because I don't have the vast love of architecture as some others here do. I'm not saying that it wasn't great. I just am just blown away by some of the other philosophical concepts that he presents to us in the following articles. And I am still processing. So I will admit that I waited too late in the week to read these articles. And I really needed more digestion time. So I'm winging it. You guys get my first impressions, like really first impressions. I'm actually gonna start with, so the two that spoke most to me is the young man in architecture. And then, so if I were saying to somebody, if they're like, well, it's 4 articles, too much to read, I would personally recommend the young man in architecture and the last page and a half of what is architecture. That would just be my suggestion. But really take the time to read all 4 of them. But if you can't, those would be my suggestions. In the young man in architecture, he speaks to us of logic, and he just beautifully describes his perspective of logic, and he breaks it down to the simple concept of, dissolving and building up. And to dissolve would be to analyze. To analyze, and then to build up would be to synthesize. And he puts that in as logic, and he says many people have the good ability to dissolve, and then other people have a great ability to put together. Some lucky people can do both, and if we consider that those lucky people who can do both, let's call them gifted, just to give them a word. And then he says, let's assume that all of us here are moderately gifted, meaning we have a fair ability to do both, dissolve and build up, which I think is a fair assessment of most people in general. I will caveat, he's speaking of architects, but I'm gonna extrapolate it to the rest of us non-architects, pure selfish reasons. So once we've put that on the table, that we all have the capability to do this, then he says, okay, so it's just, it's easy, and it just means that you have to follow your mind. And he says, he says so many things. I'm gonna actually do it backwards, because the most impactful thing of the steps he provides to us is, therefore, I say with emphasis, begin by observing. Begin by observing. So then we'll back up. What does he mean by this? He tells us that the human mind in operation is the original document. And he says, try to read it. Wasn't that a weird thing? Try to read your own mind. And yet, when you sit there and you stew on that for a little bit, we could all benefit from reading our minds just a little bit more, right? And so he states, and he uses the word plant, but just for funsies, I'm switching it to tree because it works just nicely. And he says, imagine, so this is what he tells us. If it's hard for you to envision how you would read your mind, imagine a tree growing from a single seed. There's a process, a logic, analysis, and synthesis. This is not a direct quote. I'm totally using my own words. Logic, analysis, and synthesis in the process of its expansion towards its full fruition. And he tells us how naturally and smoothly it is to make that this happens, right? It just flows. And so imagine then that this is your mind, how naturally and smoothly the mind will operate if it is not harassed or thwarted in its normal and instinctive workings. So this is an admonition for us to embrace the instinct. And that there is what he's saying. When he says start by observing, and he's telling us that we should try reading our mind, he's saying listen to your instinct. Well, I hope that's what he's saying, because that's what I'm hearing him say. I'm not an expert, right? We've already acknowledged this through the weeks we've gone down this path together. But that's what I'm hearing him say, that you should observe within yourself those things which come to you instinctively. And it bears saying that he gives one really strong caution. Don't seek originality. That's the best path towards failure in most things, he says. He says, if the mind is properly nurtured, properly trained, and left free to act with spontaneity, individuality of expression will come to you as naturally as a flower comes to the plant. For this is nature's law. And so if we wish to be creative and original, seeking to be creative and original is the best way to ensure we never attain that goal. So instead, stop, observe, look within, seek to be true to your instincts, and hopefully the creativity will find you and the originality will stem from that, which is just beautiful. And he even says something along these lines somewhere here about, this seems overly simple, but it does, right? It's just that simple and just that hard. So that's, something he tells us there is, and that's a great way to me to slide onto the next thing that he tells us. And I see it both in this art. Actually, I see it in almost all of the articles, the concept of individual development. So those of you who have walked with me these last many months know that I am a really strong proponent for improving yourself as the best path towards improving society. And you know what? I feel so validated and vindicated because that's literally written in here. Sullivan agrees with me. My head is about this big, just so you guys know right now, because Sullivan is amazing, and that any little concept I could possibly have would be in his book. Wow, just wow. But anyway, yes, he says that. And so that's, he says, give all your thought to individual development, which it is entirely within your province and power to control. And let the nationality come in due time as a consequence of the inevitable convergence of thought. I'd like to point out the absolute poetry in that statement. It sounds a million times prettier than anything I would have written. Maybe when I grow up one day, I will be half that lovely. But if you think about the depth of what he's saying there, it's like that is, that if we listen to that, we could probably solve so many things. And I really believe that. And so along that line, there's a couple other things he says that are just mind-blowing statements, but they're along the similar vein. Some of them just, they have to be put here. For those of you who don't have the time to read this, or those of you who have read it, your ears will enjoy hearing it again. He goes into a small little, I'm going to call it almost like a little commandments of statements of things that we are or are not to do and or taught, things that he sees as rights or wrong. And 3 lines are so impactful in my mind. He says, we are taught hero worship. We are not taught what the hero worshiped. We are taught that nature is one thing, man another thing. Now, this is not a new concept to us because this is what he's been saying all throughout kindergarten chats. This is just a more condensed way of saying it, but it's to hear it with the hero, and that any of you who have been in Jordan Peterson's discussions with us, this is what Peterson is telling us, that there, it's this concept of, just to put somebody on a pedestal is not enough. We have to understand why and what this person brings to the table for us individually and us as a society, because that's the value that we get will stem from that. It's, and he has this like overly optimistic and beautiful view of democracy. I will say, I get a little sad when I read his really strong statements on democracy, because I don't entirely believe that we live in the world he envisions. And maybe that's okay though, because maybe seeing the words written gives us something to strive to. But it is just, again, it's pure poetry, how he envisions us. Like he views this world as so much better than the world is right now. We are not living up to Sullivan's potential. We need to get on it, because we really, really do. But it's funny because he also tells us, he says, put yourselves in training, so to speak. Strive to develop in your minds the agility, flexibility, precision, poise, endurance, and judgment of the athlete. Now you're doing this with your mind, right? Now I will say, he does say that this is better done when you're young, but I'm going to ignore that for now and think that we can all do it equally and happily and successfully. Seek simple, wholesome, nourishing food for the mind. The human mind in its natural state, not drowsed and stupefied by a reactionary education, is the most marvelous, active agency in all of nature. So remember, if nature is us and we are nature, isn't it a mind-changing thought that we are the best that nature has to produce? Because doesn't that make you want to live up to that? If you look in the mirror and you find that maybe you're not, this would spur you on towards striving for that. And just remembering that we are not separate from nature. We have to be as amazing as a passion flower or an oak tree. That's a tall order. It's a really tall order. But he makes it seem as though it's not, which is also amazing and beautiful. And I see Ash mentioned it in the comment here about Ayn Rand, and reading the last, not the last, but The Young Man in Architecture and the last one, I can so see from whence Ayn Rand got her concepts. We had discussed this, and I do find that Sullivan is a deeper thinker. I think he's synthesized some of these concepts a little bit more strongly and with more clarity than she did. But it's interesting because she poses that cautionary tale of, failing to find the right balance, because she kind of tilted a little bit much to the analytical side. And so, whereas Sullivan didn't. And so he was able to grasp some slightly deeper concepts. Again, not an expert, just my observations. But that's kind of what I saw him describing here. And it spoke to me on what it was about Ayn Rand that, the teenager Maritza first identified with. And it spoke to her, this concept of, we are nature, and this concept of start with yourself, listen to your instincts, and move forward with the assumption that you are the wave that can maybe bring about change he says nationality, like that's even bigger than I usually think. I think our culture, our community, but he's thinking of it as this huge, like spiraling concept, which is, it's so big. It's, in the What is Architecture, he also goes on and he talks about the lack of, and he talks about it from the perspective of architecture. But I will say to you, extrapolate it from the perspective of an artist and assume that you are all artists. If you look at it from that perspective, he's talking about every one of you, every one of us. And he's saying that no distinction does exist between your art and you. And this is true of individuals and of society. And he also says to gauge the health of your society, your community, look at its art. He says, weight for weight, measure for measure, sign for sign. As are your buildings, so are you. And it's this concept that we hear all the time, garbage in, garbage out. Sullivan is just so much more poetically beautiful in saying it. But it's that concept of, what should be our symbiotic nature, our symbiotic relationship with nature. And he's extrapolating that, so we should have a symbiotic relationship, not just with nature, but with everything we create. Just think of how much, you almost can't fathom it. But if you take the time to try to do a thought process of how the world would look if every creation was considered an extension of oneself. If you are the maker of a trash can, it's a receptacle for waste, and you put zero thought into it, it's just a random trash can. But if you consider this receptacle for waste to be an extension of yourself, what else could we possibly get? And in that note, there exists now, solar powered waste baskets that compost waste while they're just sitting on the corners. There so much of the things that are wrong in our lives, not even wrong might be the wrong word, maybe idle or wasteful, need not be that way if we move forward as individuals with more meaning and more thought. And this is what I'm hearing in Sullivan. And you know what? Two concepts that are my favorites he brings up. So me and Sullivan, man, we're like this. He says it a million times more prettily than I do. But you guys have all heard me say, everyone needs a philosophy. Everybody needs philosophy. It doesn't have to be religion, anything. And you know what? He agrees. He says the same thing. And I'm actually going to read this little paragraph from What is Architecture, because it conveys this far more eloquently than I possibly could. So he's going on, he's talking about how your buildings don't show any philosophy, and how you're pretending that you have common sense, even though you have no philosophy, so then you can't have common sense. And so he says, oh wait, I'm gonna back up for 2 seconds, because I think I skipped. No, I didn't. I lie. Sorry. So this is what happens when I didn't write any notes. Sorry, guys. He says, you did not think to count the cost, but you are beginning now to catch a corner of its masked visage. The sight of the true full cost will stagger you when the mask is fully drawn aside and it stands clearly revealed. You would not foresee a crisis, but crisis foresaw you, and now is upon you. You tacitly assumed philosophy to be an empty word, not a vital need. Let that sink in, a vital need. You did not inquire And in so blindfolding your minds, you have walked straight to the edge of an abyss. For a sound philosophy is the saving grace of a democratic people. It means very simply, I think he says very simply, tongue in cheek. It means very simply a balanced system of thinking concerning the vital relations of a people. It is intensely practical. Nothing can be more so, for it saves waste. It looks far behind and far ahead. It forestalls crisis. It nurtures, economizes, and directs the vitality of a people. It has for its sole and abiding objective their equilibrium, hence their happiness. So this is, to me, is his, and I wrote in the margin here, everyone needs a philosophy. This is what he's saying to us by this, like, we will be caught flat-footed without, and he has I wish I don't know if I have it. Yes. So the next piece ties perfectly to this. He's reminding us that we don't walk alone. We never walk alone. This is yet another thing near and dear to my heart. Know that you are as old as the race, that each man among you has in him the accumulated power of the race, ready at hand for use in the right way when he shall conclude it better to think straight and hence act straight, rather than, as now, to act crooked and pretend to be straight. So we walk with the actions, creations, and stories of our ancestors. That is vital, and that is something that I feel we are losing in today's world. And so I'm just, wow, that it's here. He put that, he's writing about architecture, and yet it fits here too. And he goes on to say that the very simple way to start remembering this is honesty, plain and simple. Start trying to be honest to yourself, to others. Now, people lie. It's almost a neurological and unavoidable fact. So I don't believe when he's talking about honesty, he's talking about, every thought that comes to your head, spit it out. I already know for a fact it's not a good idea. But he's talking about the lies we tell ourselves. Because again, he believes that the individual is how we make changes. So the problem is, and I think what he's seeing is an architect who sits down to design a building and is lying to himself is going to bleed this lie from his mind through his fingertips onto the paper. And then when a building is designed, it's a lie because the building is an extension of the architect and the artist. And if the artist is lying to himself, well, then his building is a lie as well. And if you extrapolate that in all instances, in all creations, and our very actions as we move forward in this life, because what is life except a series of creations, right? It's what we do. We have to create movement and we have to move forward. And so if we're not attempting to move forward, well then, what are we doing with ourselves? But what I like is he says that, the test, plain, simple honesty is always at your hand. You always have the option to, and he clarifies, he doesn't just mean honesty. He actually puts the result, colon, in all caps, individual honesty, individual. So don't wait for your brother, sister, mother, or friend to be the ones to be honest or to check you being honest or to encourage you. You have to do it within yourself. It's the only way that we can improve. And I mean, really, that's what I hear him saying. The only way to improve the world or to improve any small circumstance is individual honesty. And I just, what folly then for man to buck against the stupendous flow of life, instead of voluntarily and gladly placing himself in harmony with it, and thus transferring to himself nature's own creative energy and equipoise. It's funny to see that line right after him talking about individual honesty. But I find that he really believes that not embracing individual honesty is the equivalent of blocking your energy flow. That's what I'm hearing him saying to us here. And when I told you guys to read the last page and a half of this last article, I fell into the trap that Sherry's been talking about for weeks and weeks. Almost everything in these pages is highlighted. I was telling Shrikant earlier before we started that it was not on purpose. It was just like I was convinced that the line I had just read was the most important line that I was gonna come across. And so I highlighted it. And then 2 seconds later, the next line, I was convinced, oh wait, no, this is the most important. And so, right, I'm with Sherry. I am struggling so hard to not like read every line of this to you guys because I really, really want to. But there's a little section where Sullivan is speaking for you. He is envisioning your reticence to what he's telling you. And he's saying, so he's saying to you, he's envisioning that you're telling him, well, this is like too much, too high over my head for me. And he's like, no, it's not. And he talks about, and he goes, it doesn't, you can't make something come into effect. It's just going to happen. He's like, well, how does it happen? And his answer, ask nature. And then he speaks for you and he imagines you're going to say to him, well, what is nature going to say? And he says, nature is always saying, I center at each man, woman, and child. I knock at the door of each heart and I wait. I wait in patience, ready to enter with my gifts. Remember that thing that Maritza says she has to do occasionally, go into a corner and cry so she can compose herself and come back and read some more? That's here, that moment. But Sullivan is describing those of us who are not convinced so easily. And he says, and then, the imaginary naysayer says, well, is that all? That's all nature has to say? Although me personally, I can't imagine somebody saying that's all, because yes, that's all. And Sullivan says, that is all. So the naysayer, well, then how do we receive nature? Naturally, Sullivan says, by opening your mind. Just that simple, right? He talks about, in the next couple paragraphs, because I'm trying not to read them all, he tells us about, thought is the instrument we should use and not force, because it's fine and it's powerful. And he says, have thought for the integrity of your own thought. For all social power, for good or for evil, rests upon the thought of the people. This is the single lesson in the history of mankind that is really worth the while. More corner crying. But it's funny he says that, because he says that's the single thought, but he has a single question for us too. At the very end of The Young Man in Architecture, he's speaking of the opportunity to learn to have this right thinking, right? Or to be seeking individually the instinct. And he says, the future is in your hands. Will you accept the responsibility or will you evade it? That is the only vital question I have come here to put to you. The future is in your hands. Will you accept the responsibility or will you evade it? And he actually ends the last article or the last essay with the same way he ended Kindergarten Chats. Begin now. Thank you, guys.
Wow. Marisa, this was incredible. This is your best presentation in this entire series. Okay, this is the best thing I've heard you say. This is just great. And I'm thankful to Sherry that she's insisted that we had to go through this essays. And your observation that this is big people food. I mean, we have digested the food in little bits, and showing you the progression of how food is digested. That was what Kindergarten Chats was about. Whereas this is, all the essays actually are directly hitting, it's leveraging all the points, and it culminates into these very crisp, powerful formulations. So thank you. This was just fantastic.